June 1944 is remembered for the scale of its military operation, but the story begins before the first boots touched the sand. Across harbors, in temporary camps, and along train platforms, men in plain uniforms prepared for an uncertain crossing. Black and white photographs from the time show crowded embarkation points, with anxious faces caught in the contrast of gray skies and white surf. The official record describes this moment as the start of liberation. Yet, when viewed through the preserved documents and scattered reports, the same moment might suggest a more complex set of purposes. Some files indicate shifts in troop lists, just days before departure, with stamped dates that do not align neatly with official accounts. Others show amendments that appear to test not only the enemy, but the reliability of Allied coordination itself. These subtle variations do not erase the widely accepted history, but they suggest the possibility of layered intentions. In the images, the motif of folded memoranda and stamped files recurs, linking the battlefield to the bureaucratic hand. Each paper trail echoes the faces of young men stepping onto wooden ramps under a cold June sky. What the public saw as a single, straightforward mission may have held additional considerations behind closed doors. These considerations, whether strategic or political, shaped the lives of ordinary men who carried rifles and wore civilian coats over issued gear. Their presence on the beaches was real, but the underlying reasons might be more complex than the familiar story suggests. From here, the narrative turns to the interiors where decisions were formed and preserved long before the first landings began. Chapter 1: Shadows Across the Channel. The days leading to the Normandy landings were marked by a mix of urgency and secrecy. Along the southern coast of England, harbors were filled with vessels of all sizes, each prepared to cross the channel under uncertain skies. Black and white photographs show rows of men in plain uniforms boarding wooden landing craft, their faces blurred by grainy film, but their posture rigid with anticipation. Wide shots reveal crowded piers, while close-up portraits capture individuals, with coats folded neatly over their arms. These images project determination, yet the atmosphere appears layered with apprehension. Official accounts describe these movements as the opening phase of liberation, but closer examination of the surviving records suggests alternative interpretations. Some memoranda from the period display amended troop lists and adjusted embarkation. Dates. A stamped file appears inconsistent with the stated departure, creating questions about what was recorded at the time. These may indicate shifting strategies or an effort to test how alliances functioned under pressure. Such changes, while administrative on the surface, carried immense human weight. Every alteration meant another unit placed at risk, another community left without fathers or sons. The motif of folded memoranda and stamped files links this bureaucratic machinery directly to the men in uniform. The contrast between the grand official narrative and the quieter, less certain administrative reality underscores the human cost of such adjustments. Archival crowd shots on train platforms remind us that this was not only a battlefront story, but also a home front story. Families watched departures with little understanding of the circumstances shaping those journeys. The beaches of France became a focal point, but the decisions made beforehand determined who would arrive and how they would fight. These decisions, preserved in ink and stamp, show both intention and uncertainty. They suggest that the opening moments of the operation may have been as much about political strength as military necessity. Each altered detail set in motion consequences that extended far beyond the shore. To understand these complexities, we must move from the embarkation sites into the interiors of planning rooms, where the documents themselves reveal more than the speeches of the day. Chapter 2: Inside. The briefing rooms. Inside the briefing rooms, the air was cooler than the crowded piers outside. Long tables were covered with folded maps and stacks of typed pages. Men in plain uniforms sat with civilian advisors at the same long table. The mood in photographs is formal and restrained, not dramatic, Close-up shots show hands tracing routes on paper with plain fingers. Mid-shots reveal telephones and typewriters as ordinary tools of the day. The recurring motif of a file stamp appears on many of the documents. A folded memorandum peeks from under a briefing sheet in several images. The official line presented these rooms as centers of careful coordination. Yet the documents that survive may tell a more layered story. An altered reference number appears across successive pages in one file. A marginal note in a different ink suggests an addendum was added quietly. These two details do not prove a hidden plan. They do, however, suggest there were late adjustments. Those adjustments might reflect shifting alliances or political caution. They might indicate testing of loyalty among Allied units. Whatever their cause, such changes shaped orders sent to men waiting by the train platform. The presence of amended pages meant new units moved into different sectors. That created ripple effects across beaches and supply lines. The human consequences were immediate and quiet. A soldier reassigned at the last hour left messages untold in a plain coat pocket. A family received a clipped newspaper headline that no longer matched the revised docket. The files show continuity between planning and action. They show how a stamped date tied a map to a given unit. They show how a folded memorandum carried a decision from room to key. The institutional interiors appear designed to produce certainty. They might also have served to manage narratives. Meetings produced minutes that read well, despite underlying uncertainty. The formal minutes may have smoothed over last-minute disagreements. The minutes might have been edited to preserve public confidence. That editing could explain why some entries do not match departure logs. The differences appear small on paper. On the ground, the differences mattered greatly. A change in assignment altered an individual's path toward the shoreline. A revised schedule meant a unit boarded a different craft. Such administrative shifts are visible in the margins and stamps. They are subtle, but they anchor a chain of human decisions. Archival portraits show weary faces under uniform lapels. Those lapels mark service and anonymity at once. The repetition of file stamps ties individual stories back to institutional or control. The rooms were also places of negotiation between national delegations. Photographs show men in different styles of formal uniform exchanging folded papers. These images convey cooperation and tension together. Notes in varying handwritings appear on the same administrative page. This suggests multiple offices influenced. A single decision. The influence might have been military in nature. It might also have been political or diplomatic. Invoices, cables, and memoranda passed hands silently across the table. The acts of passing paper became acts of shaping fate. Clerks copied orders into bound ledgers. That copying process introduced opportunities for small discrepancies. Those discrepancies show up as mismatched reference numbers or faintly altered dates. They create a pattern consistent with hurried amendment. The pattern suggests the possibility of strategic testing. Testing could mean simulated scenarios were run in real time. Testing could also mean that authorities sought to measure Allied reactions under pressure. Either way, the burden fell on ordinary men. They marched and shipped according to paperwork they may not have read. Families watched for dispatch notices, trusting the official record. When the record shifted, confusion followed at home. Local. Clerks recorded departure and arrival times in civic ledgers. Those entries sometimes contradict the stamped orders from the higher rooms. The contradiction points to a gap between strategy and logistics. The gap produced administrative stress for supply officers. It also produced moral stress for commanders responsible for lives. Conversations around the table were pragmatic in tone. They focused on routes, reserves, and timings. They also appear to have included assessments about public opinion. Some notes imply concern for news coverage and morale. That concern might have shaped the timing of certain movements. The timing decisions had ripple effects on the shore. A delay could mean landing at a different tide or light. A reassignment could move a company to a less familiar sector, Such moves altered casualty risk and recovery options. The records thus carry both strategic logic and human consequence. The briefing rooms were where those two threads met. In black and white images, the rooms feel like stages with props. The props are maps, files, and folded memoranda. The men around the table wear plain uniforms or civilian coats. The mixture of clothing illustrates blurred boundaries between military and civil authority. The presence of civil officials may have widened the scope of decisions. These decisions often balanced military needs against political aims. That balance may explain certain late edits in the files. The edits might have been pragmatic or protective in intent. Clerical staffs made the edits under supervision. Their hands left patterns that can still be read. A file stamp next to a handwritten entry locks a change into bureaucratic memory. The handwritten marginalia sometimes contradict typed instructions. The contradiction suggests that plans evolved even after formal sign-off. Such evolution is expected in large operations. It does, however, complicate later attempts to reconcile records. Archivists today encounter volumes with loose pages and reinserted sheets. Those physical inconsistencies mirror the administrative uncertainties of the time. They also complicate how memory is shaped in later years. The briefing rooms thus become a nexus between immediate decision and long-term remembrance. What was written on a page traveled from the table to the trains. The travel connected rooms to train platforms and then to the coast. A single folded memorandum could determine which unit boarded which train. That simple act changed where a man would be on the day of landing. The scale of consequence is hard to measure. It can be felt in a clipped newspaper at a family table. It appears in a ledger entry that records a missing name. The archival trail therefore speaks to both policy and personal loss. It speaks to how institutions handle ambiguity in moments of crisis. It also invites questions about transparency. Were some edits made to coordinate with allies? Were others made to protect reputations? The available evidence does not conclusively answer these questions. It does, however, highlight where the record is thin or inconsistent. Those thin places are where plausible alternative readings emerge. They are also where historians and families still look for closure. As the briefing rooms emptied and the folded maps moved toward the shore, the files closed over one chapter and opened another. The consequences of those meetings flowed outward toward docks, trains, and lives. The story in the rooms thus prepares us to consider the long journeys on platforms and the personal disruptions that followed. Chapter 3. Waiting Along. The platforms, train platforms, filled with motion and silence at once, grainy in black and white. Long exterior shots show steam and locomotives poised beneath overcast skies. Wide archival photos capture rows of men in plain uniforms standing beneath station signs. Close-up portraits reveal folded hands and coats tucked over uniform lapels. Mid-shots of hands hold clipped newspapers, and a folded memorandum peeks from a breast pocket. Official accounts present these departures as efficient and orderly mobilization. Some surviving records, however, may suggest a different emphasis behind certain schedules. Inconsistent dates appear on several departure notices, and one stamped ticket conflicts with a later arrival record, both indicating possible administrative confusion. These details are subtle. They do not nullify widely accepted narratives. They do, however, open space for plausible alternative readings about priorities and timing. Clerks at long wooden tables copied lists into bound ledgers. Their entries sometimes do not match higher-level orders appearing in stamped files. That mismatch appears as a thin discrepancy across records. It might reflect last-minute rerouting. It might also reflect deliberate adjustments to manage morale or public perception. Men boarded in groups, some led by officers in formal uniform, others gathered under the direction of civil officials. The mixture of uniforms and civilian coats highlights how military and civic authority overlapped. Families on the platform watched with folded hands, their faces blurred in archival stills. Women in plain coats held parcels and gazed toward departing trains. Children stood on tiptoe, peering at the backs of men who would soon face the sea. The motif of the train platform repeats in many images, tying personal farewells to administrative movements. Small acts carried significant consequence. A last-minute reassignment moved one company from a later train to an earlier one. That shift changed the unit's embarkation point along the coast. It also altered the conditions they met upon arrival. Those changes did not always leave clear traces in the public record. They did leave traces in the margins and in the stamps on pages. Letters sent from barracks describe men checking schedules and revising plans. Postal clerks stamped envelopes with dates that sometimes contradict ledger entries. The contradiction suggests a gap between planned schedules and lived departures. In some towns, civic ledgers record an absence the day after a stamped departure, while another ledger lists the men arriving on a different date. The discrepancy is small and technical on its face. For families, however, it translated into confusion and delayed consolations. The human cost of administrative shifts is visible in these domestic traces. Men wore their uniform lapels with quiet pride and private anxiety. They tucked folded memoranda into inner pockets, perhaps unread by many. Those papers contained directives that might have changed at the last hour. A clerk's pencil mark altered a routing notation in a bound volume. That faint line could reroute a train or reassign a platoon. The responsibility for such edits sat with clerks and officers together. Their choices were bureaucratic, yet consequential. The platforms themselves became liminal spaces between home and mobilization. Wide shots of platforms show crowds thinning as trains pulled away. Mid-shots show a man with a plain coat turning back once more toward the crowd. The pause is brief, charged with the weight of what follows. Some departures were publicized with clipped newspaper notices pinned to station boards. Other movements took place with little public fanfare, recorded in a stamped file kept behind a counter. The coexistence of public announcement and quiet departure suggests layered communications. It suggests that authorities managed visibility as much as movement. Visible departures sustained morale. Quiet adjustments minimized scrutiny. Either approach shaped the experience of travel and anxiety. Train timetables were tools of both logistics and narrative. Adjusted timetables might have been used to stagger departures and reduce crowding. They might also have been used to present a controlled image of preparedness. Where timetables differ from ledger entries, questions arise about intent. Those questions carry over into how communities later remembered the day. Archival images of station platforms, repeated across albums, created a visual shorthand for departure. The repeated motif of folded memoranda and file stamps links these visual stories back to administrative origins. The papers traveled with men from platform to quay to craft. That chain made the clerical decision a practical one on the shore. On some platforms, porters loaded kit onto wagons with methodical hands. Their work appears routine in photographs, but it is embedded within larger organizational choices. Which wagons were sent to which docks sometimes depended on a note crossed out in a clerk's hand. Those small erasures appear in scanned documents housed in archives. They are easy to miss, and yet they show a living record of change. The erasures might reflect logistical necessity. They might also reflect attempts to shield certain movements from immediate notice. Either interpretation points to the same reality. Administrative edits shifted the movement of people and resources. The effect on human lives was immediate. Men who expected one route found themselves on another. Families relying on a posted schedule discovered a different arrival date. Those surprises altered arrivals and reunions in subtle ways. The ripple extended from platform to parish, from station notice board to kitchen table. Civic officials used town registers to track departures and returns. Those registers sometimes display entries inconsistent with stamped orders from central offices. The inconsistency is an indicator of a broader disjunction between the center and the local. It suggests different priorities at different administrative levels. Local officials were often trying to reconcile official instructions with immediate logistical constraints. Their reconciliations show up as cross-outs and penciled notes. The penciled notes sometimes appear beside a stamped date, creating a layered record. In oral accounts preserved later, survivors recall waiting at stations under wet skies, listening for train whistles. Their memories often emphasize the human rhythm of departure. Those recollections sit alongside the administrative trail. Their stories fill the gaps left by abstract files. Archival portraits of these moments are framed tightly, with faces central in the composition. The faces combine resolution with a quiet worry. They suggest men preparing to encounter conditions beyond their control. Men tightened coat collars and adjusted straps on equipment in plain, efficient gestures. The gestures are ordinary, but their consequences were not. The platforms represent a hinge in the narrative. They link the decision-making rooms and the coastal embarkations. Each platform image is a junction between printed orders and lived experience. That junction is where administrative decisions met public life. It is where families, clerks, and soldiers confronted the material effects of policy. Understanding. Those junctions requires reading both the photographs and the paper trail. The record is incomplete and sometimes contradictory. Where records contradict, plausible alternative readings emerge. Those readings do not overthrow official accounts. They expand our understanding of how movement and meaning were managed. The platforms thus become sites of study, memory, and question. From the platforms, the story moves inland to the archives where the records were stored and sometimes altered. The next scene explores how those preserved files have shaped public memory and archival practice. Chapter 4. Records. In the archives, shelved in quiet rooms, the archives keep bundles of faded files and photographs. A soft light falls across rows of boxes and bound volumes. Close-up images show the rough edge of paper and the brown of age. Mid-shots capture clerks seated at long tables, their hands steady with purpose. Wide shots reveal stone buildings with plain facades and narrow windows. The recurring motif of a file stamp appears on many pages and covers. A folded memorandum appears repeatedly, its creases echoing decisions made elsewhere. Official catalogs. Present these records as comprehensive and reliable guides to action. Some physical details, however, may invite different interpretations about completeness and care. One bound volume is found with missing pages, replaced later with a replacement sheet in a different typeface. Such substitution does not prove ill intent on its own. It does, though, suggest alteration or later correction in the record. In several folders, penciled marginalia appear beside typed directives. The marginal notes vary in ink and hand, indicating multiple reviewers over time. Where marginalia and typed text diverge, questions arise about which instruction prevailed. In practice, these discrepancies may reflect hurried amendment in moments of crisis. They might also indicate cautious edits made for reputational reasons. Whatever the cause, the differences shaped later accounts and family understandings. Photographs stored with the files show men in plain uniforms and others in civilian coats. Portraits place emphasis on faces and uniform lapels rather than insignia. The absence of identifying labels on many photographs leaves names unrecorded. That silence complicates how descendants later map images to memory. In some volumes, a stamped date conflicts with a docket entry recorded weeks afterwards. The conflict is subtle on paper. It becomes consequential when reconciling movements and official tallies. Archivists find folders with pages loosely reinserted and clipped newspaper headers tucked between sheets. Those insertions sometimes alter the apparent sequence of documents. Reordering can change how a plan appears to have evolved. A reinserted sheet may shift context and therefore influence interpretation. The physical condition of records, thus, affects historical reading. Bound ledgers with tight stitching sit beside boxes of loose correspondence. The contrast highlights different archival practices over time. Some records were preserved formally, with stamps and seals. Others came from private dispatches folded into civilian pockets. The mixture of institutional and personal materials produces layered narratives across pages. A clerk copying orders into a ledger might have made minor transcription errors. Those errors can multiply across successive copies of the same instruction. Copies differ in reference numbers and in brief phrases. In one series, a changed reference number appears across pages, suggesting an administrative renumbering. The renumbering could reflect organizational restructuring. It could also reflect an effort to mask prior allocations in later summaries. Either possibility affects how researchers reconstruct decisions. The tactile quality of paper and ink becomes part of the evidence. The smell of old glue and the texture of brittle margins are the archive's language. Scholars trained to read such evidence look for patterns in stamps, notations, and typefaces. Those patterns form plausible narratives about intent and sequence. They do not, however, constitute absolute proof. The archives preserve both stated aims and the traces of their revision. A stamped file date seems to lock a decision into bureaucratic memory. Yet the presence of later handwritten corrections suggests subsequent change. When a stamped date and a marginal note disagree, the record may indicate internal dispute. That internal dispute could be strategic or procedural in nature. It could also reveal last-minute adaptation to unfolding circumstances. The human effects of these changes are visible beyond the shelves. A family letter inside a box shows a man preparing his uniform lapel for a journey. A folded memorandum tucked beside the letter links domestic life to administrative choice. These personal traces remind readers that bureaucracy carried concrete consequences. An amended order could reroute a unit from one key to another. A replacement sheet might alter which company boarded a particular craft. The effects of such changes were felt in towns and on train platforms. Local registrars and postal clerks recorded departures and returns in civic ledgers. Those local entries sometimes differ from central files held in archives. The divergence reveals the tension between local records and centralized documentation. Where the two diverge, families encountered delays and confusion. They relied on parish registers, newspaper notices, and oral communication when central files fell silent. The archive therefore contains moments of both clarity and absence. Archivists often annotate folders with accession notes, describing provenance and condition. Those accession notes themselves become part of the interpretive trail. They may note a missing envelope or a replaced sheet. They may flag a file stamp that does not match ledger dates. Such annotations guide researchers toward areas that warrant further scrutiny. The presence of repeated file stamps suggests institutional closure. The stamps indicate that a document passed through official hands, yet a file stamp cannot capture the full deliberative context in which a decision was made. It marks bureaucratic processing rather than moral judgment. The archive is thus both instrument and mirror. It records administrative acts and reflects the priorities of those who kept records. Over time, archivists and historians made selections about what to preserve. Those selections shaped public memory as much as the original events. Photographs selected for public exhibition highlight faces and ceremonial moments. Other materials remained boxed, their margins unread. The choices of curators and donors therefore influence how history is later narrated. This selective survival can reinforce official narratives. It can also obscure quieter administrative practices that mattered on the ground. In examining these records, researchers balance documentary evidence with plausible context. They triangulate stamped dates, marginalia, and external sources such as civic ledgers. That triangulation can reveal consistent patterns of amendment and correction. It might show a recurring practice of late-stage changes to orders. It may also indicate regionally specific administrative habits at work. The archive thus becomes a laboratory for assessing institutional behavior. It also becomes a repository of human consequence. Names scratched lightly on roster pages mark individuals whose lives altered after a single clerical decision. A penciled note beside a surname may signal reassignment or delay. Related correspondence captures the anxiety of families waiting near train platforms and quays. Those human echoes transform administrative traces into lived experience. In the end, the archives do not resolve all questions. They offer fragments that form plausible narratives when read together. They show stamped decisions, replaced pages, and marginal conversations that follow the maps and memoranda. They preserve the interplay between official presentation and alternative readings. That interplay prepares us to consider the rituals of remembrance in public squares and town centers. The next chapter moves to those post-war scenes, where uniform lapels are folded into civilian coats and collective memory is contested. Chapter 5: Legacies Along the Shore and Beyond. In the years that followed, towns along the coast settled into a new, quieter rhythm marked by ceremonies and everyday work. Public squares filled on remembrance days with people in plain coats and subdued clothing. Programs were printed and placed on benches, featuring folded memoranda tucked into pockets by surviving veterans. The public presentations framed commemoration as a unifying act of closure and national gratitude. At the same time, private archives preserved marginal notes and file stamps that complicate the tidy narrative. A program booklet appears with dates changed in pencil, a faint trace of revision that invites closer reading. A clipped newspaper headline is found missing a line of text, subtly altering the original emphasis. These two physical traces do not rewrite events. They do, however, suggest editorial choices shaped by local officials and custodians of memory. Portraits in monochrome show men wearing uniform lapels, now hidden beneath civilian coats. Close-up, images focus on hands smoothing lapels and folding programs with careful gestures. Wide shots of processions show mixed groups that include formal uniforms and ordinary dress. Mid-shots of memorial plaques reveal inscriptions that emphasize sacrifice and collective duty. The motif of the file stamp recurs in museum dossiers and municipal ledgers. The stamp places an administrative seal on memory while also marking archival custody. Families who attended ceremonies often carried small packets of papers, some official, some personal. Those packets fused institutional narratives with family stories. Oral recollections recorded decades later emphasize waiting, returning, and absence. They often highlight small domestic details, such as a coat left on a chair or a letter unread in a kitchen drawer. The personal items linked to administrative files in public archives create layered evidence. Local registrars kept civic ledgers showing departures and delayed returns. In several towns, these local entries diverge slightly from central files. The divergences suggest differences in recording practices or timing. They may also indicate attempts to manage public understanding of recovery and loss. Memorial programs were sometimes edited after initial printing to align with official statements. That practice could be practical, and it might also indicate sensitivity to public reaction. Over time, civic leaders and archivists selected which photographs to include in exhibitions. Some albums emphasized ceremonial exactness. Others preserved candid portraits that reveal private grief. The selection process itself shaped how subsequent generations remembered the event. Museums and municipal collections preferred images that offered dignity and composure. Family albums more often contained awkward, immediate photographs that showed uncertainty. The contrast between curated public displays and private piles of papers created an uneven memory landscape. Educational materials drew from official archives and public exhibitions. Schoolroom lessons, civic talks, and local histories often echoed the curated narrative. At the same time, grassroots efforts collected oral histories and private letters, Those grassroots projects filled gaps left by official sources. They also emphasized mundane consequences, disrupted careers, altered town economies, and long-term demographic shifts. A single administrative note could redirect a unit and change a local labor pool. A clerical crossout in a ledger could delay a return and alter a family's livelihood. These small bureaucratic acts accumulated into measurable social effects. Municipal budgets shifted to support housing for returning families. Parish registries recorded births and absences in patterns that reflect the wider movement of men and resources. Social rituals adapted to accommodate loss and reintegration. Remembrance ceremonies often included a moment of silence and the reading of names. Sometimes those names matched archived rosters cleanly. In other cases, names were missing, or entries conflicted across files. The inconsistencies became focal points for later inquiry and family frustration. Where a file stamp did not match a ledger date, questions followed about responsibility and oversight. Researchers examining marginal notes found annotations suggesting last-minute changes. Those annotations sometimes referred to diplomatic concerns rather than operational necessity. Such findings do not indict institutions categorically. They do suggest that memory was managed alongside logistics. The management of memory had policy effects. Decisions about which photographs to restore, which letters to preserve, and which ledgers to digitize shaped public access. Funding choices determined what archives were prioritized for conservation. Municipal councils and charitable trusts influenced preservation efforts. The result is uneven availability of records across regions. Some communities possess rich visual archives and oral histories. Others rely on a few boxed volumes with brittle pages. The uneven survival of materials affects how stories are told and who is heard. Grassroots initiatives have therefore become crucial in reconstructing fuller narratives. Volunteers, local historians, and family researchers index photographs, transcribe marginal notes, and seek corroborating evidence in civic ledgers. Their efforts sometimes reveal plausible mismatches between public commemoration and administrative paperwork. In many cases, these investigations prompt public conversations about transparency and responsibility. Town councils have occasionally reviewed local archives in response to community inquiry. Those reviews have led to public exhibitions that juxtapose official programs with raw documents. The juxtaposition invites viewers to consider the difference between ritual and record. It asks whether commemorative forms might obscure administrative complexity. At the same time, such exhibits foster civic dialogue about memory and accountability. Veterans groups and family associations contribute to these discussions, providing personal context to archival traces. Their testimonies often emphasize continuity of care and support networks. They also recall bureaucratic frustrations when records did not align. The persistence of ambiguous records can have legal and symbolic consequences. Pension claims, service recognitions, and civic honors sometimes depend on archival proof. Where records are thin or inconsistent, families encounter procedural obstacles. These obstacles become part of the broader legacy, shaping how communities seek redress or recognition. Public education campaigns about archival literacy aim to reduce confusion and help citizens navigate repositories. Those programs teach how to read a file stamp, how to interpret marginalia, and how to triangulate local ledgers with central files. The educational work thus turns archival practice into civic practice. It encourages a more pluralistic understanding of memory that includes both curated displays and private documents. Over decades, changes in commemorative practices have reflected shifting social priorities. Early post-war ceremonies foregrounded unity and duty. Later memorials expanded to acknowledge the varied experiences of communities. Contemporary remembrances often emphasize reconciliation and local impact. They may foreground the stories told by family letters and municipal registers alongside formal programs. This expanded focus does not eliminate ambiguity. It does, however, create space for multiple truths to coexist. The motif of the folded memorandum persists at the center of these stories. It links the shore to the office, the train platform, to the town hall. The folded paper carries decisions, doubts, and daily consequences across time. In the end, the legacies along the shore and beyond are not only about grand statements, they are about how administrative acts intersected with private lives. They are about which documents were preserved and which were allowed to fade. They are about the quiet, regionally varied ways societies coped with loss and change. These observations lead naturally into questions about contemporary memory and policy. How do modern communities reconcile official commemoration with archival ambiguity? What responsibilities do custodians of records bear in presenting contested histories? The closing section will explore these unresolved questions further and consider ongoing civic responses. The legacy of the Normandy landings does not rest only on sand, sea, or steel. It lives in archives, town squares, and the quiet spaces of family homes. Black and white photographs remind us of men in plain uniforms and women in civilian coats, gathered on train platforms and in civic halls. Each image carries the weight of both public ritual and private doubt. The official story frames these events as a clear march toward liberation, yet preserved details may suggest layers of adjustment, omission, and revision. A stamped date that does not align with a later ledger or a marginal note added in a different ink opens questions about intent and presentation. These details are not sensational. They are ordinary traces of human administration. But their ordinariness gives them power. They show how memory is curated, not only lived. The persistence of folded memoranda, clipped newspapers, and file stamps ties generations together through paper and ink. Families searching for names in civic registers confront the same ambiguities that scholars find in archives. These continuities remind us that history is not static, but always subject to reading and rereading. As communities continue to hold ceremonies, and as institutions decide which documents to preserve, new gaps and new questions will appear. What remains unresolved is how societies choose to balance official commemoration with the complexities that the record quietly suggests. The closing of one chapter opens another, inviting us to ask what future generations will inherit from the stories we keep and the silences we allow.